The Anglo-Saxons were a Germanic people originating from northern Europe who migrated into Britain early in the 5th century AD. These first Anglo-Saxon armies that came into Britain might have been as small as 100 or 200 men in 2 to 3 ships. These early invaders were able to create small kingdoms and drive off the local populations, but they didn't make much headway deep into the British countryside until well into the 6th century. By this time period, and for the next few centuries, war was a constant way of life for the Anglo-Saxons. Personal grievances, insults, and acts of revenge are considered major reasons for aggression during this age. However, the concept of the feud would be the major factor for such sustained conflict in Anglo-Saxon lands. It usually didn't stem from a simple brawl between different factions. It had more to do with cycles of vengeance among rival groups, usually connected by kinship ties. The trigger was usually a murder. Rulers before the end of the 6th century lacked lasting authority and acquired power primarily through violent action. They did not control social relationships, nor did they have the authority to enforce their wills without the threat of violence. Those rulers who separated themselves from prevailing social bonds came to dominate social relationships, allowing them to gain more followers and control over dispute resolution. The story is the same for the different levels of the aristocracy. When the ealdormans and thanes of Anglo-Saxon England came to loggerheads over competing interests, their result might be homicide, and this was usually followed by a very damaging feud between rival families. Whether gaining control over feuds to build authority or using it as a political strategy against opponents, the feud was a central concept in the construction of power in Anglo-Saxon England. Also, there was a compelling need in Germanic communities for young men to prove themselves as warriors. It was a vital part of their coming of age. The military tradition among Anglo-Saxons in the early centuries usually began with the fostering of a young warrior in another man's household. Some written accounts point to boys entering training as young as 8 years old, learning to exercise, wrestle, jump, and run. There is evidence that the next stage of some boys' training came at around 14 years of age, by being given arms and horses. Some were a part of a group of youths that engaged in all sorts of slaughter and pillage by the time they were 15. The main weapons of the day included the spear, the sword, the throwing axe, javelins, and to a lesser extent the bow. Each of these weapons required a degree of skill to wield effectively. Hunting may have played a role in the training of the youths, particularly the boar hunt, which involved the use of dogs, nets, and a spear, with a hefty blade to penetrate the hide of the animal. The association of young men with ferocious animals across the Anglo-Saxon and Nordic worlds is well known. Warfare played a central role in the making of a warrior leader and the subsequent impression he made on his followers. The acquisition of riches and gifts, with which he could attract a larger retinue and spread the power of his kin group, was driven by his prowess on and around the battlefield. In the early Anglo-Saxon period, when a king summoned his army, he would at first expect his personal retainers to arm themselves. At the same time, he would expect the duties of his skilled veteran retainers to be fulfilled. These skilled veterans were men who had served with their lord's household throughout their youth, and had been rewarded with a little land themselves, upon which they found their own group of dependent men. Given the right circumstances, such a man could rise to become as powerful as the lord he served. They would turn up for a campaign with their own retinues, consisting of men who had received various gifts, such as rings, treasures, and war gear. Above these veterans was the senior warlord, for whom this was all being done. Ultimately, the head of the kin group was the man whose influence, wealth, and gift-giving capabilities were the greatest. In a system such as this, his power was immense. He was the king. The name derives from the Anglo-Saxon word kuning. Starting in the 9th century, during the Viking invasions of Britain, the making of a warrior leader became even more pronounced. Wars were fought by the Anglo-Saxons as part of a ruler's protection, expansion of his kingdom, or other patrimony. The leader had to fight such actions or risk losing the men he had attracted to his household. It was a cyclical thing that meant that warfare was virtually constant on a number of levels. The kings not only had to continuously attract new followers, but he also had to further expand his wealth to acquire more gifts and riches, to preserve those already under his command. This warfare dynamic needed constant feeding from the ranks of freemen who had the right to bear arms. The consequences of the loss of manpower through military ill-preparedness were felt by Alfred the Great in the early years of his reign. A mixture of treachery and poor strategy saw the invading Danish army all but divide and conquer Wessex in the 870s. For a brief time, Alfred became an exile within his own kingdom. However, the way in which he fought back by reorganizing his kingdom's fighting resources and acquiring wealth and loyalty through reconquest is further evidence of the success of the Anglo-Saxon warfare model. The economics of warfare were not lost on the leaders of the time. Many battles during this period were fought near ports. Portable wealth was never far from the mind of any war leader in Anglo-Saxon England. Some rulers made no secret of the fact that cattle raiding and other forms of portable wealth formed part of their foreign policy of the day. It was in the clear interest of the king to protect such places from harm, and from the early 10th century onwards, there were even royal decrees actively to promote trade in such centers. On the battlefield itself, early Anglo-Saxon armies were involved in a predominantly infantry struggle, requiring bravery and nerve. It was a scene of great noise, commotion, and sheer bloody-mindedness. It would seem that whichever side broke first and fled was the loser, and the side remaining in possession of the battlefield was the winner. These armies were probably quite small in the early Anglo-Saxon period, numbering no more than in the low hundreds. The spear and shield were the main weapons of the average Anglo-Saxon warrior, with helms, armor, swords, and other weapons reserved for the kings, noblemen, and other well-to-do men. But by the time of the Viking invasions in the 9th century, it would all change. The armies would be larger and the average Anglo-Saxon warrior would be better equipped. Garrisons throughout the kingdoms would hold a standing army that would measure in the tens of thousands. Helmets, swords, and mail shirts had become much more common and worn by a greater number of men. On the field of battle, the shield wall was a vital tactical formation used by the Anglo-Saxon armies, as well as the Viking invaders. Many battles were described as a clash of shield walls. The Battle of Brunanburh was fought in 937, in which the Anglo-Saxon English king Aethelstan defeated a confederacy of Vikings and Scots. An English poem describing the battle gives an image of a clash of shield walls, the power of the sword and spear, and the bravery in hand-to-hand combat of the protagonists. Besides the shield wall, there isn't much evidence of any kind of other tactical formations or strategy on the battlefield deployed by the Anglo-Saxons, with some minor exceptions. It seems that most of their attacks were by brute force, crashing into the enemy lines. Unfortunately for the Anglo-Saxons, shield walls were vulnerable on their flanks, and this can be seen at the decisive Battle of Hastings in 1066. The invading Duke of Normandy, William I, was up against the Anglo-Saxon King of England, Harold II. At Hastings, the Normans were able to eventually find a way to prise open a flank, and then began to roll up the line toward Harold's standards, as most of the English army was on foot. Harold was eventually killed, and the English were defeated in the battle. In the years that followed 1066, Anglo-Saxon England became Anglo-Norman England. The ancient and renowned Anglo-Saxon England was no more.
Despite having emerged victorious for the time being, the Normans themselves, along with all their English domains, would eventually fall under the domination of the French Countship of Anjou. This royal house would effectively recarve England into a unique identity all its own by challenging the higher French king in the nation-defining conflicts known today as the 100 Years' War. But that is a story for another day.